Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 91. Chapter 91. Soon after his admission to the Masonic Brotherhood, Pierre went to the Kiev province, where he had the greatest number of serfs, taking with him full directions which he had written down for his own guidance as to what he should do on his estates. When he reached Kiev, he sent for all his stewards to the head office and explained to them his intentions and wishes. He told them that steps would be taken immediately to free his serfs, and that till then they were not to be overburdened with labor. Women, while nursing their babies, were not to be sent to work. Assistance was to be given to the serfs. Punishments were to be admonitory and not corporal. And hospitals, asylums, and schools were to be established on all the estates. Some of the stewards, there were semi-literate foremen among them, listened with alarm, supposing these words to mean that the young count was displeased with their management and embezzlement of money. Some, after their first fright, were amused by Pierre's lisp and the new words they had not heard before. Others simply enjoyed hearing how their master talked, while the cleverest among them, including the chief steward, understood from his speech how they could best handle the master for their own ends. The chief steward expressed great sympathy with Pierre's intentions, but remarked that besides these changes, it would be necessary to go into the general state of affairs, which was far from satisfactory. Despite Count Bezukhov's enormous wealth, since he had come into an income which was said to amount to 500,000 rubles a year, Pierre felt himself far poorer than when his father had made him an allowance of 10,000 rubles. He had a dim perception of the following budget. About 80,000 went in payments on all the estates to the land bank. About 30,000 went for the upkeep of the estate near Moscow, the townhouse, and the allowance to the 3 princesses. About 15,000 was given in pensions, and the same amount for asylums. 150,000 alimony was sent to the countess. About 70,000 went for interest on debts. The building of a new church, previously begun, had cost about 10,000 in each of the last 2 years. And he did not know how the rest, about 100,000 rubles, was spent, and almost every year he was obliged to borrow. Besides this, the chief steward wrote every year telling him of fires and bad harvests, or of the necessity of rebuilding factories and workshops. So the first task Pierre had to face was one for which he had very little aptitude or inclination: practical business. He discussed estate affairs every day with his chief steward, but he felt that this did not forward matters at all. He felt that these consultations were detached from real affairs and did not link up with them or make them move. On the one hand, the chief steward put the state of things to him in the very worst light, pointing out the necessity of paying off the debts and undertaking new activities with serf labor, to which Pierre did not agree. On the other hand, Pierre demanded that steps should be taken to liberate the serfs, which the steward met by showing the necessity of first paying off the loans from the land bank and the consequent impossibility of a speedy emancipation. The steward did not say it was quite impossible, but suggested selling the forest in the province of Kostroma, the land lower down the river, and the Crimean estate, in order to make it possible, all of which operations, according to him, were connected with such complicated measures, the removal of injunctions, petitions, permits, and so on, that Pierre became quite bewildered and only replied, "Yes, yes, do so." Pierre had none of the practical persistence that would have enabled him to attend to the business himself, and so he disliked it, and only tried to pretend the steward that he was listening. The steward, for his part, tried to pretend to the count that he considered these consultations very valuable, for the proprietor and troublesome to himself. In Kiev, Pierre found some people he knew, and strangers hastened to make his acquaintance and joyfully welcomed the rich newcomer, the largest landowner of the province. Temptations to Pierre's greatest weakness, the one to which he had confessed when admitted to the lodge, were so strong that he could not resist them. Again, whole days, weeks, and months of his life passed in as a great rush, and were as much occupied with evening parties, dinners, lunches, and balls, giving him no time for reflection as in Petersburg. Instead of the new life he had hoped to lead, he still lived the old life, only in new surroundings. Of the 3 precepts of Freemasonry, Pierre realized that he did not fulfill the one which enjoined every Mason to set an example of moral life, and that of the 7 virtues he lacked 2, morality and the love of death. He consoled himself with the thought that he fulfilled another of the precepts, that of reforming the human race, and had other virtues, love of his neighbor, and especially generosity. In the spring of 1807, he decided to return to Petersburg. On the way, he intended to visit all his estates and see for himself how far his orders had been carried out, and in what state were the serfs whom God had entrusted to his care, and whom he intended to benefit. The chief steward, who considered the young count's attempts almost insane, unprofitable to himself, to the count, and to the serfs, made some concessions. Continuing to represent the liberation of serfs as impracticable, he arranged for the erection of large buildings, schools, hospitals, and asylums, on all the estates before the master arrived. Everywhere, preparations were made not for ceremonious welcomes, which he knew Pierre would not like, but for just such gratefully religious ones, with offerings of icons and the bread and salt of hospitality, as according to his understanding of his master would touch and delude him. The southern spring, the comfortable rapid traveling in a Vienna carriage, and the solitude of the road all had a gladdening effect on Pierre. The estates he had not before visited were each more picturesque than the other. The serfs everywhere seemed thriving and touchingly grateful for the benefits conferred on them. Everywhere were receptions which, though they embarrassed Pierre, awakened a joyful feeling in the depth of his heart. In one place, the peasants presented him with bread and salt and an icon of St. Peter and St. Paul, asking permission, as a mark of their gratitude for the benefits he had conferred on them, to build a new chantry to the church at their own expense in honor of Peter and Paul, his patron saints. In another place, the women with infants in arms met him to thank him for releasing them from hard work. On a third estate, the priest, bearing a cross, came to meet him surrounded by children whom, by the count's generosity, he was instructing in reading, writing, and religion. On all his estates, Pierre saw with his own eyes brick buildings erected or in course of erection, all on one plan, for hospitals, schools, and almshouses, which were soon to be opened. Everywhere he saw the steward's accounts, according to which the serfs' manorial labor had been diminished, and heard the touching thanks of deputations of serfs in their full-skirted blue coats. What Pierre did not know was that the place where they presented him with bread and salt, and wished to build a chantry in honor of Peter and Paul, was a market village where a fair was held on St. Peter's Day, and that the richest peasants, who formed the deputation, had begun the chantry long before, but that 9/10 of the peasants in that village were in a state of the greatest poverty. He did not know that since the nursing mothers were no longer sent to work on his land, they did still harder work on their own land. He did not know that the priest who met him with the cross oppressed his peasants by exactions, and that the pupils' parents wept at having to let him take their children, and secured their release by heavy payments. He did not know that the brick buildings, built to plan, were being built by serfs, whose manorial labor was thus increased, though lessened on paper. He did not know that where the steward had shown him in the accounts that the serfs' payments had been diminished by a third, their obligatory manorial work had been increased by a half. And so Pierre was delighted with his visit to the estates, and quite recovered the philanthropic mood in which he had left Petersburg, and wrote enthusiastic letters to his brother instructor, as he called the Grand Master. How easy it is, how little effort it needs to do so much good, thought Pierre, and how little attention we pay to it. He was pleased at the gratitude he received, but felt abashed at receiving it. This gratitude reminded him of how much more he might do for these simple, kindly people. The chief steward, a very stupid but cunning man, who saw perfectly through the naive and intelligent count and played with him as with a toy, seeing the effect these prearranged receptions had on Pierre, pressed him still harder with proofs of the impossibility and, above all, of the uselessness of freeing the serfs, who were quite happy as it was. Pierre in his secret soul agreed with the steward that it would be difficult to imagine happier people, and that God only knew what would happen to them when they were free, but he insisted, though reluctantly, on what he thought was right. The steward promised to do all this in his power to carry out the count's wishes, seeing clearly that not only would the count never be able to find out whether all measures had been taken for the sale of the land and forest and to release them from the land bank, but would probably never even inquire and would never know that the newly erected buildings were standing empty and that the serfs continued to give in money and work all that other people's serfs gave, that is to say, all that can be gotten out of them. All right, so that concludes my reading of chapter 91. I'm now going to proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 91. Practical Business. The last time we met with Pierre, he was making big changes in his life. He had converted to Freemasonry, and he had separated from his toxic wife, Helene. Most importantly, he had taken some time alone with his books to study his newly adopted philosophy. This is all very well and good, for, as Tyrion Lannister reminds us, a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone if it is to keep its edge. Fair point. But a sword can be as sharp as H.L. Mencken's wit, and it's still not going to cut anyone down if the swordsman doesn't practice swinging it. Pierre Bezukhov is not a practiced swordsman. He enters today's chapters high on his ideals. He's going to free his serfs, build them schools, and, as he promised his new brothers, during his initiation into their order, avoid the society of women. By the end of the chapter, his serfs are even more overworked than they were before and still unfree. The structures he envisioned being built to educate and care for them remain empty, if even erected at all. And as for women, 19th century prose prudery precludes Tolstoy from indulging us in nothing more than a report that the female temptations were so strong that he could not resist them. Though, come on, given Pierre's appetites and predilections, I'm pretty sure he tore through that Russian countryside in an orgiastic romp of unadulterated sultanesque debauchery. Pierre could blame others for his inability to convert theory into practice. His head steward, for instance, really takes advantage of him in today's chapter. But in the end, Pierre remains accountable only to himself. He's got to work harder on making these changes he wants to see in his life. Tolstoy, twice in just barely 4 pages today, writes that Pierre has no aptitude for practical business. Well, it's time for him to get practical. He should take a page out of one of Tolstoy's other great books, Anna Karenina, and be more like Levin. He needs to get his nose out of his books, get his hands on a scythe, and just get down to work mowing some grass or something. That will get him out of the slump that he's in. Daily meditation. That is why the philosophers admonish us not to be satisfied with merely learning, but to add thereto practice also, and then training. Epictetus, The Discourses. All right, so that concludes my reading and reflection on chapter 91 of War and Peace. I hope you liked it. I did. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook, A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are below. Your support is greatly appreciated. Tomorrow we'll be reading and reflecting on chapter 92. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.